Hi, this is Penny Carlson. Welcome to another segment of Topics in Digital Photography. This video is part of a two-video sequence, which will show you how to edit people in Lightroom and Photoshop to make them look better. Before we start, let's reset Photoshop. That way, once we open our photos into Photoshop from either Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw, we'll be working with the same tools and all of our settings will be the same. That way it'll be easier to follow me. To reset Photoshop, hold down the Control, Alternate, and Shift keys on the PC, or if you have a Mac, hold down the Command, Option, Shift keys. Then right-click and open Photoshop. This dialog box will appear asking if you want to delete the preferences or settings file. Click Yes. Once Photoshop opens, choose the drop-down menu over on the right and make sure that you have the photography palette up. Now you can either close Photoshop or reduce it. Now let's open Lightroom. My workflow for almost all my photography starts out with Lightroom, do some basic processing there, and then I move my photos into Photoshop if needed to do more complex processing or add finishing touches. I need a professional headshot. I don't really consider myself a people photographer, but I do know my way around Lightroom and Photoshop, and pretty much I can make any picture look better. Since I didn't have anyone to take a picture of me, I set my camera up on a tripod and used a remote shutter release. The first thing I'm going to do is make a virtual copy of the picture. This isn't an absolutely necessary step since Lightroom does non-destructive editing and you can always go back to your original picture at any point in time by looking at your history on the left-hand side. However, we're going to compare before and after pictures. I can hide or show the panels on the sides by either clicking arrows or using the tab key. Now let's go into the develop mode. We do that by either hitting D from within the picture or going up to our develop mode on the top panel. I usually close all the panels except for the develop panel on the right, so I have a larger picture to work with. I think my white balance is a little bit off, so there's a couple ways you can deal with that. One is to try auto mode, and I don't like the way that's turning out. So we'll just hit Control or Command Z to undo our last mode. If you have something that's light gray in your photo, you can use that to set your white balance. This photo is kind of hard because there really isn't anything that's gray in the photo except for maybe the corner of my watch band. So let's use that. The color palette can help you find an area that's a little bit more gray. You want to get that in your center. This looks good. We'll click on it. And I do think that's a better white balance, but I maybe want to warm it up because people look better warmer. So I'm going to just fool with the sliders a little bit until I get a look that I like. Usually when I'm trying to fix exposure on a picture, I'll start out with auto, just to see what the computer thinks is a correct exposure. This looks horrible, so I'm going to hit Control Z to reset it. Got a bit of a shine on my forehead, and we'll work on that in Photoshop. But we can maybe bring the highlights down just a bit. And you can fool with these sliders to see whether you're getting a better look. To a large extent, there's no science to adjusting the sliders except for your black and white point. You're just doing it to your taste. For your black and white point, hold down the Alt key or the Option key on the Mac. Adjust the white slider until you start to see pinpoints of light come in. Also notice how this is affecting the histogram at the top of the palette. We don't want to see information on the histogram going off the sides of the graph on the right or left. Now let's adjust our black points. We hold the Alt key down and slide it until we just start to see some color come in. Now I'm going to go to my Lightroom presets on the left-hand side, and we're going to use this preset to sharpen faces. This preset tries to focus on sharpening eyes without making the rest of the person's face look too sharp, which can harshen faces with people. Clarity slider is great for working with people. Clarity is something you usually want to bring up in a landscape photograph, but it's the opposite with people. If we bring it down a bit, it softens our features. We'll work on that once we bring our photo back in from Photoshop. Now I'm going to go down to my lens correction palette. I like to do this with all my photos. And if your lens is in there, you can hit enable profile correction and it'll put things in for you automatically. If your lens isn't there, you can try some of the different profiles that are in there and see if they make your photo look better. Now let's crop our photo. I think a 1:1 ratio looks good for a headshot. I want to get my arms and my remote shutter release out of the picture. I'm just going to crop it down to what looks good to you. Click Done. I want to make this photo consistent with what we're doing with the Adobe Camera Raw version, because when I do the Adobe Camera Raw video, I'm going to cheat and use the same part for Photoshop. So I'm going to come back to our history panel and reset back to the point where we sharpen faces. This way we'll crop when we go into Photoshop. The history mode will let you go back to any point on your photo, so it can be quite useful. Now let's bring the photo up in Photoshop. To do this, right click and hit Edit in Photoshop. Whenever I come into Photoshop, I always duplicate my layer, so I'm not working on my original photograph. Photoshop is not non-destructive editing, but by using layers, you can always go back, just as you can in Lightroom. Whenever we want to move or change the place where the photo is, we want to use our hand tool. So let's go on the hand tool, fill screen. I don't have my screen maximized. Let's do that. Now we can fill screen again, and we're ready to crop our picture. So hit the crop tool, hit Control minus to bring my size down just a little bit so I can see the whole perspective. For portraits, a 1:1 perspective is pretty good. So we're just going to crop it down into what we think is going to look good for our final photo. It's a headshot, so we want to zoom in on our upper torso. Once you think it looks good, hit the check key. We can go back to our hand and hit Fit Screen. We're ready to start working on our photograph. To keep ourselves organized and be able to go back and figure out what we did, it's always good to label our layers. First thing I'm going to do is remove the shine on my forehead. So I'll call this layer Remove Shine. To remove the shine on our forehead, we want to darken a little bit. So we want to go over and find our burn tool, which is under this tool right here. We right click and then left click on the burn tool. The burn tool will let us lighten shadows, highlights, or midtones. Now it looks like highlights are a problem, so let's start there. And let's make our exposure change fairly subtle. So we'll put it down to 15%. Our default brush is soft. See, our hardness is all the way to the left on the slider. And that's the brush you usually want to use. If you want hard lines, you can use the next brush that it gives you 100% hardness. Or you can just fool around with the sliders. Let's just go over our forehead, see what happens. And I'm not really liking the look I'm getting with that. So we have a history panel over here, and we can click on that and go back to any point. Let's look at what happens if we switch to midtones. I'm going to bring this up again a little bit by hitting my Control or my Command plus key. And changing the midtones is doing just what I want to do. I've got a little bit of shine on my lips over here. So we can just kind of go over this. If we go over it again, the effect is cumulative, so we're changing it by a larger percent. And once I get to a point that I like, I want to create a new layer so I can always go back to this layer that I liked again. My next layer, I'm going to double click and rename it. And on this one, I'm going to get rid of those deep laugh lines. I want to take a few years off of me because I'm going to post this picture on Facebook. Half those people haven't seen me since grade school. Can't afford a real facelift, but a Photoshop facelift is cheap. The best tool to remove lines and blemishes on people's face is a spot healing brush. That's the default over here. We're going to left click on it. And at this point, I'm just going to concentrate on the laugh lines and really hard lines on my face. And if I mess up at some point and don't like something, I'll just hit Control Z. And sometimes we need a little more subtle touch with these lines. I know this is looking a bit extreme at this point, but I have a trick to make it look a little bit more realistic and just kind of take a little bit off with these lines. At this point, I'm not fooling with the more subtle lines because I want to treat them a little bit differently. Once I get done taking out most of my laugh lines, I want to make things look a little bit more realistic. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to turn the opacity down on this layer. To do this, we can either type in a percent, or if we click on the opacity and hold down our left mouse, we get what we call a Scrubby Slider, and we can just kind of slide our opacity over to the left till we get something that looks a little bit more realistic. It looks good right about here. We can use this little eye right here to turn the layer off and compare our before and after. Definitely took a few years off my face. Now I want to work on some of the wrinkles on my forehead. But before I do that, I'm going to have to do some work with my layers. I can't just duplicate my laugh line layer because it's at 53%. And if I do that, the next layer I work on is going to be at 53%. If I turn it up, then I'm going to undo what I just did, as the next layer will become the visible layer. The top layer is always your visible layer unless you turn it off. And I could merge my remove shine and my laugh lines, but I want to keep my remove shine as a separate layer. What I'm going to do is click on my remove shine layer. I'm going to right click and duplicate that layer. Then I'm going to hold down the shift key, click on my laugh line layer, right click, and merge the two layers. Now I've got a layer at 100% opacity that has the softened laugh lines. We're ready to duplicate this layer and start working on the rest of my wrinkles. Since I know I'm going to do the same trick with lowering opacity with my next layer, I'm going to actually duplicate my laugh line layers twice. We'll double click on our top layer and call it Remove Wrinkles. At this point, I'm just going to remove the wrinkles around the eyes. So now we're just going to come in and do the same thing that we did with our laugh lines. This may be a little bit trickier since we've got finer lines here. I can use my right and left bracket key to make my brush larger or smaller, although sometimes it doesn't show up too well on my screen capture software. And often it looks like I'm using a different size brush than I'm actually using. And going around my eyes here, my brush is actually quite a bit smaller than how it appears in my screen capture software. Anytime I don't like a move, I'll just hit Ctrl-Z to undo it. When I'm getting really close to my eyelashes, I'm having a little bit of a hard time with the spot removal tool. So instead I'm going to use the clone tool. The clone tool is a little bit different than the spot removal tool in that the spot removal tool uses the computer to figure out an area that's a good match for your selection. With the clone tool, you tell Photoshop what to use to replace your selected area. So click on the clone tool. To specify the selection area, hold down the Alt key on the PC or the Option key on the Mac and left click. You only have to specify one spot, as Photoshop will go from the spot you specified in the same direction that you're moving your brush. I'm just going to specify a spot a little bit lower down on my eyes. That way Photoshop won't combine my eyelashes as it tries to remove the wrinkles under my eyes. Depending on what I want to do and what's working better, I'll move back and forth from the spot removal tool to the clone tool. Okay, I think we've done a pretty good job of removing the wrinkles around the eyes. But let's tone it down a little bit by using the same trick that we used with our laugh lines. Since these lines aren't as deep as the laugh lines, we're not going to turn the opacity down as much as we did with the laugh lines. I think about 90% opacity looks pretty good. And we can turn it off and back on again to see our difference. Now we're going to merge the remove wrinkles from the eyes layer with the extra laugh lines layer that we made so we get our opacity back to 100%. I'm going to duplicate that layer and we're going to call this layer Remove Blemishes. And there's just a couple of areas I need to deal with. If you do your own pictures, you're probably going to work more on the blemishes where I need to work on the wrinkles. I'll use my hand tool to move around on the picture and go back and forth from my hand tool to my spot removal tool. With this layer, I'm not going to want to turn down the opacity. This layer is at 100% opacity, so we can just duplicate it. I am going to duplicate it twice because I may want to turn the opacity down on my next layer. I'm going to call my next layer Remove Wrinkles. I'm just going to remove some other random wrinkles. I could even go over spots that I've done before if I felt that I wanted to soften the wrinkles a little bit more. Uh-oh, nothing's happening here. Well, that's because I don't have my layer selected. You need to have the layer that you're working on highlighted in Photoshop for things to work right. We haven't really worked on the forehead yet. I'm going to take some of those wrinkles out. And I'm just looking better and better and better. Photoshop is a wonderful thing. Go down and deal with some of my wrinkles under my neck. There we go, looking pretty good. I'm going to turn the opacity on this layer down to 80%. I'm just looking for something that looks good without being too unrealistic. I'll blow myself up a bit by hitting Control or Command plus. See if there's anything else I need to fix. And if I'm happy where I am, I'll merge the layers again. Now let's just turn these settings off and see how much we've changed. And you can see there's a pretty big difference between the beginning and the end, though I've tried to keep it subtle enough so that it still looks like me. Now I'm going to save my file and we'll open it back up in Lightroom. I save my files as Photoshop files. You have the option at this point to save it as any type of file. If you want to post it right to Facebook, you could save it as a JPEG file, but I'm going to work on it a little bit more in Lightroom. Okay, let's go to Lightroom. And if you've got your Lightroom set up with Photoshop as a plugin, the photos should come in automatically. And there it is. I think this is a good time to take a break. This video is getting long enough, and we'll start the Lightroom portion in a new video.